Okay, back to Italian Renaissance theater. Looking at theater architecture, we're starting around 1580. So before 1580, you didn't really have a reason, much need at all, for permanent theater architecture in Italy. Most of these things were being done in court. So they slowly began rising that need of having a public theater for cities by around 1580. Between 1580 and 1584, the Teatro Olimpico, one of the more important and famous theaters in Italy, and is still around. It is the oldest surviving Renaissance theater, and it was built by the Olympic Academy of Vicenza. Remember I told you they become important later? The group that was created in 1555 to study Greek theater. These are the people that built this theater, and they made it. It was designed by the architect Andrea Palladio, if you've ever heard of him. And basically what it looks like, you can find it online still, is it looks like an outdoor Roman amphitheater, but roofed indoors. And the ceiling in it is painted to look like the sky, so it still looks like an outdoor amphitheater. It's actually pretty cool. And it has perspective scenery up in the doors that you would normally find in the back of a Roman Cine France. If you look through them, they have perspective scenery going all the way up there. So it looks like you're looking down a street when you see through the doorways. So it's a pretty cool theater, and you can take a look at it. I might have put some pictures online, I can't recall, but if not, you can find it pretty easy online. The next important theater was the Theater at Sabbioneta. Now, the reason the Theater at Sabbioneta is important, it was built in 1588, is that it's very similar to the Teatro Olimpico, but we believe that it actually is closer in size and scale to what the court theaters of that day were like. So it gives us an insight of what the court theaters, the theaters inside palaces, would have been like. It seated about 250 people or so. The next important one is the Teatro Farnese, and that is considered to be the prototype of the modern stage, built in 1618, and has a permanent proscenium arch in it. Again, you can find pictures of it online as well, but the reason it is so important is really that was the basis of what all modern theaters were using as their sort of foundation, because of that permanent proscenium arch. Moving into machinery and special effects, the Italians were really well known for incredible special effects. They had people flying, gods coming in and out on chariots, floating in on clouds. Sea monsters were appearing from waves that were in the middle, they were on stage, and it was all accomplished by rope rigging systems. And trapdoors and spiral cylinders are being rolled, and I've got some special effects links and or drawings that are online, so you can take a look at them and see what they look like. These innovative sound effects, and all of these were the progenitors of what we now have as modern special effects. Candles and oil lamps were used to light the footlight area. I don't know if you're familiar with the footlight area. It's the area down at the very bottom of the stage, downstage area there. There used to be lights on the floor called footlights that would light upward. We don't use them anymore because they actually give a pretty garish shadow to you, and unless you kill them with enough top and side light, it makes you look pretty nasty. But that's what they had at that particular point in time. So that's what they had to deal with. They did use some mood lighting and stuff, and what they did with that is they simply took tinted liquids and they would put it in front of the oil lamps that are at the footlights, and that would give sort of a blue color or whatever color the tint that they put in the liquid to give it some sort of a mood on stage. So they're already really experimenting with mood lighting and things that we wouldn't have expected then. We figured, oh, they just put a bunch of candles out there. Not necessarily. They had ways to do this. They had stands on the side of the stage, what we would call trees now. You see them mostly in dance shows, but they had ones on the side there. They had candles in them, and to give more lighting on the stage for the side. Candles were typically used for the house lighting, for the candelabras and whatnot, but oil lamps were becoming popular in the early Renaissance. Looking at music and dance. Music was often used in dramas and occasionally throughout it, but it was almost always used in scene changes to mask the sound of all of the machinery that they were using to move these sets. It could be vocal or instrumental or both, and it figured very prominently in intermezzi. Of course, obviously, it figured also very prominently in opera, because that's what it's about. And dance also played a role in dramas and intermezzis, especially in intermezzis. This is where we actually begin to see the foundations of ballet, not with the French. The French pick it up and run with it, and then actually lose out to the Russians later on. But the foundations, the beginning of ballet, right here in Italy. Now we move on to another really, really majorly important era, or it's not really an era, but a section in Italian history, and that is Commedia dell'arte. Commedia dell'arte is extremely important. It's one of the, okay, so we said already, Italianate scenery, really important. Neoclassicism, really, really important. Opera, majorly important and influential throughout the known world. Fourth one is Commedia dell'arte. That is exceedingly important in Italian history. So, Commedia dell'arte rose somewhere around the middle of the 16th century, so mid-1500s. The first clear reference of it is in 1568. So what is Commedia dell'arte? Commedia dell'arte is a bunch of stock characters performing productions that are predominantly improvised. They have sort of a skeleton shell of what happens, like Act 1 this happens, Act 2 this happens, Act 3 this happens, right? And the actors get together and they discuss what's going to happen. Okay, Act 1, we're going to start here. Act 1's going to end when I say, you know, oh, my butt hurts. And they agree on this, and they go, okay. So that means that from the opening of this character entering to where some character says, oh, my butt hurts, the general idea of, oh, he's going to go here and he's going to lose his money and he's going to have to go to him to try to find it, that's Act 1. Then that's it. And they improvise the whole thing. And they do this each act. So each act is a tagline that, okay, now all the actors know, oh, that's the end of the act. We move on to the next one. All predominantly improvised, using stock characters. Again, remember I said the importance of the comedies in Rome and the stock characters in the Roman comedies. This is it. They carried through into here. This will mean these comedies, these stock characters here, will be an influence into 18th century vaudeville, which is then into early American television and even into sitcoms today. So they had it. The style of Commedia dell'arte is the dramatic form from which the zany arrives. All right, and the zany is a servant, a character, and the most famous zany is the harlequin, or arlecchino in the Italian. So if you see arlecchino, it actually that's the harlequin character. And this is also the style from where slapstick arose. If you've ever heard that term, usually harlequin, the character of harlequin, had a big long paddle, which was two pieces of wood hinged together at the bottom, that when he smacked someone, they would clap, and that would make a slapping sound. And so that's where you get the term slapstick from. That's from this style. So it started as a very, very improv kind of thing with just traveling kind of troops. But what ended up happening is that it slowly became a little more codified. They still were using improvisation, but they started getting sort of structured groups, improv troops, right? With their stock characters. Typically, you played a stock character, that's what you played. You didn't get, oh, I'm Harlequin today, but I'm Pantalone tomorrow. No, you were Pantalone or you were Harlequin. That's kind of how it went. And these were all played with masks to the point where, just like Greek and Rome, to the point where when you walked out on stage, the audience knew exactly who you were. There didn't have to be any discussion, any ad-libbed dialogue about who you were. They knew who you were. You walked out on stage, and from the mask and your dress, you were obviously Harlequin, or you were obviously El Dottore, or whatever. So this is how it evolved into this very simple but elegant style of comedy. And the Commedia dell'arte literally means artistic comedy, right? And it's probably named as sort of a contraposition to how theater was actually being done at this point in time. You know, very structured and followed the classical style. And this was like, no, we're art. We create it on the spot, right? and that happens. Um, Companies usually 10 or more, and they, each actor developed a specific type, and there were. We're going to go through a lot of the characters here as I continue to go down here. The Commedia dell'arte is also where the type of improvisation that was created is known as Lazzi, L-A-Z-Z-I. If you've ever heard that term before, Lazzi, that's what it means, the improvisation that was born from this type of theater, Commedia dell'arte. The bare bones scenarios you see in your notes are, this is what I was talking about with, okay, in Act 1 this happens, this happens, this happens. And if I've got one somewhere, let me find it. I've got an actual bare bones scenario that they found, and this was actually used at the time in certain shows. So we know that this is an actual one, and it's, yeah, here it is. As the curtain rises, Harlequin is ill. The doctor and his servant try to determine what is wrong. The doctor, after much enticing, gives Harlequin a shot on his backside with a huge syringe. Harlequin is found to be pregnant. Harlequin is a male, by the way, just to let you know. And delivers 3 babies, one of which survives. Not terribly funny, but back then perhaps it was a little more humorous. Well, consider infant mortality rate back then was pretty damn high, so it's not something that is uncommon. Not to say that that made it funny, but anyway. So Harlequin then nurses and mothers the baby. He teaches the child to walk. He complains to the doctor regarding the problems of rearing a child. The child is whipped by Harlequin. The play ends with Harlequin teaching the child to read. Throughout the play, Harlequin is made fun of by his friends. That's all they get. Now think about the plays that you do, plays that you act in, and how meticulous the dialogue and the scenes are all structured and laid out. This is all they get for their entire show. And they would decide when Act 1 ends. So, since he gets a shot in his backside with a huge syringe, then there you go, is that perfect tagline. It's like, ow, in my butt, right? And they go, boom, that's the end of Act 1. When Harlequin says, ow, in my butt, we're done. And so we move on to Act 2, right? That's how they do it. And they'd improvise the whole act. So, it was popular in the 16th and 17th centuries, but it has sort of lost its force and driving force and developed into other forms such as vaudeville in the 18th century and so on and so forth. But let's look at the characters here. We've got Masters, El Capitano. El Capitano is a great character. He was a very pompous character and military, as you could guess by the term Capitano, right? Supposedly a war hero, but it ends up he's really a coward who's absolutely unskilled, carries a sword and walks around, rather braggadociously, as it were, and brags to all the other characters and so on and so forth about his skill and his virility with wooing women and so on and so forth. When really he's a loser, he doesn't really ever get the woman, and he never even draws his sword in the play whatsoever. He's a coward. He runs from things. So it's this really interesting kind of funny character. By the by, he had this really strange walk, where his legs were sort of bowed out real far, and he sort of walked very pelvic forward, shoulders up and whatnot, and constantly bragged about women, but then they would make fun of him or bring up the fact that he wasn't a good lover. And the funny thing is that a lot of those characters were poking fun at Spanish soldiers, because Italy had been in wars since the very early 1500s up until 1560. And Charles V, who was the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, as well as the Emperor of Spain, was one of the major players that Italy was at war with. So they're kind of making fun of their enemies, their military enemies, through this character. Then we have Pantalone. Pantalone is usually a merchant, and a greedy, meddling man. He quite often would wear clothes that were way too tight for him, so he's kind of heavy set, but he's wearing tight clothes so he can impress the ladies. But heavy people wearing tight clothes, just as funny back then as it is today, I guess. And he kept trying to attract the ladies with that, and he never really could. So he would always have some kind of problem, either financial or with women, losing women to a younger man, something along that line, that they would always make fun of him about, and he would try to fix, and that's his big problem. He would turn to one of the servants to try to get him out of his situation. I imagine those situations are crushing to him, but they were pretty damn funny to everybody else, so kind of sad. El Dottore is usually a neighbor at Pantalone, and El Dottore is usually dressed in long black robes with a cat, and he depicts a learned man, so a lawyer, a physician, usually walks around spouting Latin that doesn't actually make any sense, giving people medical advice or prescriptions that are deadly or just wrong, that nobody in their right mind would take, you know. So he's basically a pompous ass who really doesn't have the knowledge to back up his pompousness. And so then it was interesting that actually later on in this course of Commedia dell'arte, his costume began to change to a large black hat and a white ruff, because that sort of was a nod to the plague doctors of the time. So we have servants. Arancino is the Harlequin. And usually he was very clever. He was smarter than the other servants, and usually smarter than the masters. And never really bothered to think. He just always jumped into things without thinking them through first. Movement was very acrobatic, slapstick in nature. Again, that's where the slapstick comes from, is this particular character. And typically was dressed in patch-type clothing. This is where the Harlequin with the funny hat and the diamonds and they're part of their costume, that's where that came from, this particular character. Punchinella is another character. I know I skipped Brighella, but I'll get back to Brighella in a second. But Punchinella is another character that is a servant, usually kind of stupid, not terribly bright. Pot-bellied. At some point in time, actually, the pot belly got so far out that they had to make his butt bigger in order to sort of counterbalance him. And that became this really weird-looking sort of almost trollish type looking character who was very crude, very vulgar, always dishonest, and if you've seen it's Disney's Hunchback of Notre Dame, in the beginning of it, in the big carnival, there's a booth where these two puppets are beating on each other, a sort of fat paunchy one with the stick beating on the other one. That's Punch, and that is called a Punch and Judy show. All right, that's where that came from. If you've ever heard that reference, if you haven't, then I guess it doesn't mean anything to you. So there it is. More shit you don't need to know in your life, and now you do. But a Punch and Judy show was based off the Punchinella character. All right, Brighella. Now, Brighella is one that could actually switch between a servant or a master. Sometimes it could be a master, and if so, that they would then they would be a pettalone, they'd be a merchant. And usually the plots, a lot of plays plots were Brighella trying to get one over on the master. All right, he could play a soldier, he could be a musician, he could be a thief, he could be, you know, almost any kind of profession, but he's always looking to play jokes on people, humiliate people, take advantage of people, and that's pretty much that character. Then you have the young lovers. All right, young lovers were basically a young man and a young woman who were in love. The woman originally played by a man, but then later the women were allowed to play in those roles. And the young lovers were usually pretty absolutely ignorant of anything else that's going on around them, because they're just so damn much in love, and they paid attention to only themselves, only each other. So they're really, the interesting thing is they don't really take place in they don't take place in a whole lot of the meaningful part of the performance, but it was their love that was sort of the basis of the storyline in general. Typically because someone like Del Dottore or El Capitano actually wanted the young woman, but she was in love with the young boy, so they weren't going to get a chance at her. And then, of course, they would go to a servant and say, "Get me the girl," and the servants would come up with some bullshit machination of how they were going to do it when they're really duping the master in the first place. I mean, that's kind of the basic concept of how these things would go. We see some dates here, and to be honest, they're not terribly important on your list here. You get the first record of Italian professional acting troupe in 1545, 1565, the first reference to Commedia dell'arte figures. 1571, the Gelosi Company visits Paris. 1587, Compediente Company is in Spain. And 1634, Italian plays perform in Warsaw. The only reason that that's even there and is important in any way, shape, or form is that it shows now how Commedia dell'arte spread across Europe and how it influenced it. But it's not like going to be something I'm going to ask you on the exam or anything along that line. I just wanted you to have that on there so that you knew it and realized that its importance, because it did really influence everything. Right? Before we hit the decline of Italy, there's another type of theater, or type of play actually, that came out around this time, and it was called Commedia Erudita, Commedia Erudita, Commedia Erudita, which translates into learned comedies. Now these appeared around the 1400s, and they weren't medieval or classical imitations, but they were they generally associated with around the 1500s is where their beginnings are. So they're not based on Christian doctrine, let's say. They followed classical principles, so they were written in the 5-act system, so on and so forth, followed the unities, but they were written in prose and produced by amateur actors, usually at court. And the stories were typically about a young man's pursuit of an inaccessible young lady. Shit doesn't change, does it, people? All right. So let's look at the decline of Italy finally. So the end of our notes. By the late 17th century, Italy had lost all of its importance politically, economically, even culturally. France, Spain, and Austria had taken over as the world powers in Europe, and the only thing seriously that Italy still contributed was opera. At that point in time, opera was still important in Europe, and it became the only thing that Italy even mattered about. Because you have to keep in mind that if you're talking by the late 17th century, so by the late 1600s, by this time, England, France, and Spain had all, well, the Dutch also, Holland as well, but they had all colonized the New World and become rich from it. Italy didn't. Therefore, it lost out on that, becoming a world power. So politically and economically, it was worthless. It had nothing to give to the world. But it did have opera. That was about the only thing it did. So that ends Italian Renaissance theater.